A'udhu billahi minash shaitanir rajeem. Bismillahir rahmanir rahim. Assalamu alaikum, everyone. It is wonderful to see you guys here. Let me begin with a short prayer. Rabbi shrah li sadri wa yassir li amri wahlul 'uqdatam min lisani yafqahu qawli. Allahumma salli ala Muhammad wa ali Muhammad. It is wonderful to be with you guys here today for this much awaited talk with Sitara. So I'm just going to wait for a couple of notifications to see that people are able to hear us and people are able to see us. Let me just quickly check. Yes, we are live. Awesome. Awesome. And so for this much awaited call with Sitara Akram, many of you have been actually waiting, and rightly so, because it is a very important topic. As I have been announcing for a few months now, that inshallah I will be hosting and promoting the work of Muslim women scholars, and there are many of them now that have bold voices that speak for the truth, that speak for the rights of Muslim women. So I'm very, very honored to have Sitara Akram with me today. She's an independent researcher with interest in Islamic law, economics, and women's rights. She recently completed her PhD in Islamic finance from the University of Leeds. Her thesis is on riba, or usury. She works full-time as a mid-senior level leader at the University of Leeds. She's passionate about justice and reducing inequalities. She has taught both at universities and in the community, more recently reading the Quran with teenagers. So, and she's married. She's the mother of two twin sons, both now also attending university. So welcome, Sitara. It's so wonderful to be with you today.
Assalamu alaikum, Iram, and assalamu alaikum to everyone who's in the audience today. And thank you for having me, actually. It's very generous of you to open up your platform and showcase female voices. I think it's a very important thing that needs to happen. So I'm really grateful for this opportunity, and I'm really looking forward to this discussion, actually. This is something that gets me very excited and gets me out of bed every morning.
And me too.
It really does.
And me too. And like I said, that we are in it together. This is for you, for me, for our children, my daughters, maybe your granddaughters, maybe your daughters-in-law. It's for all the Muslim women and for Muslim men too. This affects everybody. We're talking about
Yes.
50% of the ummah, so obviously everybody gets affected by this. And alhamdulillah for this opportunity. We are living really in very exciting times because we're able to do this now, which I don't think we would have been able to do even 10 years ago. So this is a really exciting time. It's a very blessed time, alhamdulillah, and talking about something that is very near to my heart, to your heart, and is needed really for so many Muslim women. So let's dive in, because I know you are a researcher. You have other areas of interest as well, but for me, what is of most interest is, of course, Muslim women's rights. And as I've been saying, we are all holding different pieces of the puzzle. So I want to start by saying thank you for doing the research, for doing all this work that you have done, quite literally for me, as you have done for other women, because it affects all of us, right? I am not a researcher. I won't be able to do it, but you have done it. And inshallah, you're going to be writing a book as well. So we as women are all holding different pieces of the puzzle. So it is an honor to lend my platform to allow you to have your voice and talk about what you want to talk about. And that's what I request from other women. We all need to do our part. We all need to play a part in this. We can't be waiting for a knight in shining armor to come and rescue us and do this for us. This is our responsibility, not just because we want to get the rights for women, not just correct the injustices, but also because this is God's will. This is the hukum of Allah and His Prophet Sallallahu Alaihi Wasallam. So this is a jihad. This is ibadat for me, you know. So jumping right in, what I would love for you to, I think it would be very helpful to begin talking about Islam and the rights of Muslim women by describing to the audience the environment that was in the world, especially in Arabia, when Islam actually came for the first time.
No, it's a really interesting question, Iram, and an important one, because often in the field of Islamic studies, or when we talk about Islam, or we listen to different people, scholars talk about Islam, you will find that in very traditional settings and traditional discussions, the history is of Islam is not discussed. And one of the things that I talk to my sons about this as well, is that Muslims have what I call an ahistorical relationship with Islam.
Mm,
So by that, I mean we're stuck in a bit of a time warp. So
mm,
on one hand, we would say Islam is timeless. But on the other hand, when we try to interpret Islam, we say that we should practice Islam as it was practiced 1400 years ago, without really giving cognizance to the fact that 1400 years ago, society was very, very different.
mm-hmm.
It was primarily very violent. It was not a society where women were safe, women were inherited as property. It was a very harsh environment as well, especially where the Quran is revealed, in the Hijaz, in the desert, where life was very, very difficult. So, because those social and historical conditions are not taught to us in formal spaces of learning, it takes time to get a sense of what the Quran was actually addressing, because
Yes.
the Quran is not revealed in a vacuum. The Quran was revealed to a living, breathing society. And there is a very beautifully written book, actually by a Christian bishop who was a great admirer of Islam. His name is Kenneth Cragg. He's passed away now. And he's written a book which he has titled The Event of the Quran.
Wow.
So, what he says is that the Quran, whilst its message is timeless, the Quran itself is an event in history. It was revealed at a particular point in human civilization, and it was talking to a living, breathing society. So, I'll
Mm,
give you examples. You would have noticed, anybody who reads the Quran, you would have noticed that the Quran talks about rain a lot and
mm,
green vegetation, because those things held huge amounts of value for people living in a desert.
mm.
The Quran talks about figs, and it talks about olives, and it talks about honey, because those are the foods that people in that society ate.
Yeah.
It talks about camels, it talks about horses, it talks about ships, because this is how people traveled. So the Quran is addressing a living, breathing society. The Quran is very orientated as well about fairness in trade, for example, because the Quraysh were famous as traders and merchants.
Mm,
And it's primarily talking to the people in Makkah, because that's where the revelation starts.
yeah.
So that is why a lot of the, especially if you read the shorter chapters in the Quran, they're talking about rain, and they're talking about thunder, and they're talking about the gathering of the clouds, because those are really visual cues that make sense to that society. I mean, we could flip it a little bit and say that the Quran, for example, does not mention pineapples. But
Mm,
if it was revealed in Malaysia or Indonesia, in a tropical country, it might have mentioned pineapples. So even the choice of the wording in the Quran, the language it uses, which is the very high-end Arabic language that was spoken by the Quraysh of Makkah at that time, what the late Amin Ahsan Islahi calls the taksali. In Urdu we say taksali, like really high register of Arabic, a really high level of Arabic language that the Quran uses. So the Quran was an event in history, even though the Quran is timeless in its message. At the point it was revealed, it was talking to a living, breathing society, which is also why some of the laws that it mentions were very relevant to those people, like qisas, like diyat, like sudden divorce, for example, paying women even for breastfeeding their children. Those were actually the customs in that society. So the Quran is talking to that living, breathing society. So I always feel that if Muslims are to really understand the importance of the Quran and the value system that it's bringing, they need to have a sense of what type of society is it talking to.
Totally agreed.
Right. So if, and this is why when we come across some really emphatic verses in the Quran, and actually those verses can give you goosebumps. There's a verse in the Quran in which Allah says that, those infant girls that you bury alive, when they are resurrected on the day of judgment, they will say, "For what sin were we killed?"
Mm,
It's an extremely moving verse. But the Quran is referring to a particular custom in that time where women were considered to be a burden. And so some families were perfectly happy burying their infant daughters alive because they did not want to raise them, did not want to have the responsibility.
mm,
The other thing that's really important from a historical perspective is that at that time, slavery was extant in society. So the Quran brings slavery into discussion quite a lot because slavery was at that time prevalent in society. So the Quran does regulate the institution of slavery. There are a lot of verses around that, as we know. but also, and we will delve into it in this talk, inshallah, some of the verses around dress code, etc., and hijab actually do link back to that background of slavery, how slave women used to dress differently from women who were free or women who came from aristocratic households. So when you bring history into your understanding of the Quran suddenly becomes alive, and then you can see what moral principles it is upholding. And I think that's really important in deepening our connection with the Quran and understanding of the Quran. It also offers a bit of a corrective. I'll give you an example. So these days, you will see if you Google on the internet about the dress code for Muslim women, and you see this kind of black robe and a black scarf, kind of like this monochromatic, very plain, very austere, a burqa, like a burqa, very austere. It's very austere, very harsh. And a case is made that this is how women in Arabia used to dress. But actually, when you delve into historical evidence, you realize that that is not how they used to dress. And so, when I mean that Muslims have an ahistorical relationship with the past, I also mean that we tend to imagine a past that did not exist.
Agreed.
And this is where the complexities come from when some of the really rigid interpretations come in, and we're told that, the older generations followed Islam like that. My question would be, did they? Is that what historical sources tell us? And actually, they don't. But by removing history from discussions and by messing up our relationship with history, I think we've done ourselves a great disservice. And one of the other problems we've created is an identity crisis for ourselves, because we don't understand our own history. We don't understand the history of our own knowledge tradition, which is beautiful, by the way. The Islamic knowledge tradition is one of the most outstanding knowledge traditions. There's a reason why Islam was the dominant civilization for 1,000 years across the globe.
Yeah.
We don't have any sense of the knowledge tradition of Islam either, and how that knowledge tradition came about. So absolutely, I think it is one of the most crucial questions. And I always say, and I say this at home as well, I wish that more and more Muslims would send their brightest children to study history. Study the humanities, because I think that is where we will discover some of that knowledge, build the tools and techniques to discover some of that knowledge. And that's what happened with me when I started my doctorate. I was absolutely astonished by how much there was. And I was actually quite humbled by the fact that I knew very little about the history of Islam. That was my delving into it.
Yeah, that I think, thank you so much for that, Sitara. I think that was, I can't remember when I realized how little I knew about Islamic history, but I do remember realizing that there's no way I can truly understand the message of Quran without first understanding where it was revealed, what kind of conditions there were, what people did, how they acted. Because, and correct me if I'm wrong, in many instances, for example, slavery, I feel that Allah Ta'ala gave instructions which were supposed to act like a framework. Like, this is where you're beginning. You've been doing things in a certain way. And if I give you orders to change it completely, it's going to disrupt your society. But this is where I want you to go. So here's the framework. And I want you to go gradually now in this direction. So, such as what was done with slavery, where it was made virtually impossible to keep slaves or to make free people, turn them into slaves and stuff like that. Unfortunately, Muslims were the last ones to abolish slavery. That is a very shameful thing for us to realize, that actually Muslim countries were the last ones, one of the last ones to abolish slavery. We should have done that centuries ago, but we didn't. But that's not today's topic. So what I want to go back to is, uh, I would love for you to talk about your journey with hijab, because I find it very interesting that you used to wear the hijab. Um, I never did, but I've struggled with it for many years. So we'll talk about that in a minute too. I think maybe first let's talk about um, the autonomy of women. And the reason why I want to go into this now is, as we were talking about the fact, the environment in which Quran was first revealed. I keep telling people, like, think about this thing. Why was the message of Islam so radical? Right? If you think about it, because people will say, oh, because people were polygamous and Allah, Nabi Karim Sallallahu said, worship only one God. First of all, they knew the name Allah. There were many worshippers of Allah, and Khana Kaaba was there, and they had other idols in there. but there were monotheistic religions present. Jews were there, Christians were there. So this was not so radical. Abrahamic religions were, monotheism was not so radical. Nabi Karim Sallallahu was a monotheist, his family, many members of his family. What was so radical about Islam? Let's talk about that.
Yeah, I think I think there are scholars much more mature than I am who have captured this beautifully, and I can't remember now whether it was Dr. Fazl Rahman or some other scholar. It's just that the name escapes me. But when you were asking me that question, the phrase that came to my mind was piety in action.
Hmm.
So I think what is wonderful about Islam is that it is piety, your connection to God, but in action.
Hmm.
And so, whereas if you look at the Torah, when the Torah was revealed, the Old Testament, if you ever pick up the Bible, the Old Testament is what was called the Torah. The Torah is what was given to Prophet Musa alayhi salam
Mhm.
on Mount Sinai, and it was a set of rules and regulations. And then a few centuries later, when the Gospels are revealed to Isa alayhi salam, the Gospels focus more on the hikmah or the wisdom of the law. It does not give him a new law.
Hmm.
What the Quran does, and this is where I think Javed Ahmed Ghamdi's point is very powerful. He says that remember that the Quran is the last book of God. It's not the first book of God, it's the last book of God. So, as the last book of God, it's doing a couple of things. One, it is preserving the message of God. The Quran is Al Muhaymin, the preserver, the guardian of revelation. But the other thing it does is, and that it is piety in action. So, if you read the verses in the Quran which mention Salat or the 5 daily prayers, and namaz, as we say in Urdu, after almost every mention of Salat, the Quran says zakat.
Hmm.
So, you do your prayer and then you do charity. You do your prayer and you do charity. And that is what is remarkably revolutionary about Islam is that it ties your spirituality with your concern for human beings.
Hmm.
So if you're a pious person, if you're a God-fearing person, you'll be a compassionate person, you'll be a charitable person, right? So the moment you finish your prayer, your next concern is people.
Hmm.
And this is why in the Quran, right at the center are the most vulnerable people in society. So constantly the Quran talks about the widow, the orphan, the traveler, people who are enslaved,
Hmm.
people who are caught in a debt spiral, people who are strangers in a land and they don't have any family or friends around them, don't have a social network, and people who are very poor. And the Quran's concern constantly is around that. So within that concern for the collective, then it gives us a set of laws. And that's what makes it really revolutionary, that it gives us a set of laws. And those laws are absolutely predicated on very important universal values of truth and justice and compassion. So the whole legal framework of the Quran focuses around that. And that is what's so revolutionary about it, is that it is setting certain principles of justice. This is why Islam is so astonishing. Even to people who are outside the Islamic tradition, who study the Islamic tradition, are taken aback by the principles of justice that the Quran is establishing. Quite famously, people often quote this, and I think they're right to quote this, that in Harvard University, in the department where they teach law, they have a Quranic verse there about justice, about Muslims being qaim bil qist, always stand firm in justice. Even if our own shadow abandons us, we should still stay firm in justice, even if it means acknowledging our error. So this is what was so revolutionary about Islam, was that immediately it was translating that connection to Allah, your fear of Allah, your conscientiousness, your love of God into love of human beings. And that is where the whole framework of the Sharia comes in. And I think that's what's so revolutionary. It kind of combines the beauty of God's revelation and actually turns it into an actionable framework. So it's not just spiritual, not just spiritual teachings, and it leaves us at spiritual teachings. No, it then gives us a framework to create a better society because it's reforming the individual. So it's doing tazkiyah or purification of the individual, and then giving us a vision of what a fair society looks like. And I think that's what's absolutely so revolutionary. And this is why women's rights, if you look in context of, about 2000 years of patriarchy, 2500 years of patriarchy and patriarchal oppression of women, because patriarchy is an oppressive system. It's,
Yeah.
it's a system of power. And the Quran is hitting each and pretty much each and every assumption on which patriarchy is built. The Quran does that. So, in the next few minutes, inshallah, when I talk about agency of women, I will go through some of those things.
Yeah, and we will be getting to those those points very quickly, because I know
Yeah.
some people are waiting very
Yeah.
impatiently. Because I have to tell you, Sitara, that briefly, I was very disenchanted with Islam, and because my questions weren't getting answered, and I could see very clearly as a
Mhm.
thinking, logical person that this is all unjust. This is not fair. So I became disenchanted many years ago. And of course, we all need, when we go through hardships in life, we need God. We need God by our side. So I did need Allah by my side. And, I won't go into the story today, but eventually when I decided to do my own research, and was this is 20 years ago almost. Information was not as easy to find. There weren't people like you doing YouTube videos. So it was so difficult, because everywhere I looked, it seemed that, no, women are not equal, no, women are not as intelligent. And I would be like, but I used to get the highest marks in my class. I always was. There's evidence proving that women are as intelligent, sometimes more intelligent. It doesn't make sense. Why is Quran, why is my tradition, Islamic tradition, saying the opposite? But then so many other things also, the confusion between how to be a good Muslim but also achieve your dreams as a woman. Can I be a leader? Why can I not be a leader? So many things. And it was deeply hurtful. And this is what I want to kind of pre-frame. I want people to understand, who are watching today or who will watch this recording later, that it is deeply hurtful for women to, we all carry this burden to a certain extent, unless you're lucky enough to be born in a household where you got the right education of Islam from the beginning. There is this deep trauma in us that we are born inferior, and we didn't even choose the gender that we were going to be born into, but we are born inferior, and we are inferior in so many ways, we're told. And we are never, this is what creates hopelessness. We are never going to achieve the level of nobility that men have, again, through no fault of our own. And we are never really going to be as dear to Allah as men are. And there was a deep trauma, because we're talking about the creator. We all need the love of our creator, in our hearts, and to know that he's by our side. So to be born with this notion that, we somehow, Allah belongs to the boys club. And since men have an axe to grind against us, or they want to oppress us, so Allah also wants to oppress us. Like, it's a deep trauma for women.
Mhm.
But once I began to understand the truth, it was deeply healing, and I'm grateful to Allah Ta'ala for showing me the truth. And that is why we're doing what we're doing. That the truth is actually the opposite. The truth is, now I tell people, I personally feel, you could disagree with it, but I personally feel that women have a special place of privilege in Islam. And I said this to Ramdi Saab, by the way. You mentioned Ramdi Saab. And guys, please know that we don't belong to any sect. So we have a lot of respect for different scholars. We don't agree. I know for myself, I don't agree 100% with any scholar. I have a lot of respect, for example, with Ramdi Saab, but I disagree on many things too. But I said to Ramdi Saab not too long ago, because I always raise question about women's rights with him, right? He knows, okay, if she's going to ask a question, it's going to be about women. So I said, Ramdi Saab, मुझे तो लगता है कि अल्लाह हमारे नखरे उठाता है. Islam is very partial towards us. And he laughed and he said, आपने समंदर को कूजे में बंद कर दिया, आप ये चाहती हैं. This is what you want, right? That Allah हमारे नखरे उठाता है. I'm like, मुझे तो लगता है, I actually feel it कि हमारा नखरा उठाया जाता है औरत का इस्लाम में. Anyway, so let's start unpacking this now, Sitara. So
Mhm.
I want to do this in a way that is going to be as much as we can do in this one sitting, for people to be able to understand. Number one, we kind of showed the backdrop. This is what was going on, not just in Arabia, by the way, but in the entire world. Women were considered either inferior or property of men, or like what Aristotle used to believe, that they are a subspecies within the human species, that they're so inferior to men that they should be called another species. So that was the prevailing mindset. And then here comes Islam, and totally radical message, which is women are equal.
Mhm.
So I'll let you start with that now. Yeah.
Yeah.
Are women equal? Let me ask you that. Are we equal to men?
Absolutely, they are. Absolutely, they are. And I think I'll just give a little bit of an insight into my journey as well. So, born in Pakistan, lived there for the first 28 years of my life. My education, kind of when I did my MBA, that was in Pakistan, and I moved to Britain when my twins were 3 years old. They were toddlers, and I was pretty much grappling with the same issues, Iram, and I think those issues are also related to what we're hearing now about women, the messaging we're hearing about women. And I would say that the battering we're now getting and the amount of battering and punches that we've got in the last 30 years is a phenomenon over the last 30 years, particularly. And it's to do with the rise of a particular form of Islam, which is political and also, I would say, Arabized. So it's a particular version of Islam which is exported to the rest of the Muslim world through madrasas, through writings, through preachers. And that is an Islam that has battered women a lot. So I really feel, especially for the younger generations, the millennials who followed us and Generation Z who've grown up in this anxiety ridden kind of discourse about women, which is very demeaning towards women and actually towards men. I think often men don't realize how demeaning it is towards them. So I
Agreed.
think there's been a particular pressure point, but because we've been born and raised in this, we feel that this is Islam. This is what Islam always looked like. It did not. Okay, so I think we have to understand that we are at a particular moment in time. Farid Isaac uses a very good word. He calls it the now moment. So our now moment is different from the now moment that my mother saw, which is different from the now moment that my grandmother saw. Okay, so the environment in which we're growing up, the messages we're getting, they change. So in the last 20 to 30 years, we've seen a resurgence of patriarchal messages in Islam.
Mhm.
And there has been very much a what we now call Salafism, kind of a rise of very fundamentalist thinking as well, which is very black and white, halal and haram, and rules based. Whereas when we were taught Islam as an ethical tradition. We were taught ethics: do not lie, do not steal, do not cheat, speak very kindly towards people who are vulnerable, and if you have somebody working in your house, pay their wages before the sweat dries on their body. That
Exactly.
is the Islam I grew up with. And then you said your 5 daily prayers and you did your fasting. So our Islam was actually quite small. The Islam that young men and women are now facing in is Islam of rules. And the rules are so big, nobody can ever keep track of them. It's impossible. Enter your house with your right foot and enter your bathroom with your left foot and start trimming your nails from the right. And, who can keep track of that? Nobody can. So there's a particular moment in time that we're living through. There's a very politicized version of Islam and a very insecure version of
I just
Islam
want to
that we
put
live
a little bit of just one quip in here that, by
through.
the way, if you ever do a study of cults and how cults are maintained and how they keep their power on people, it's all about the rules.
Oh, absolutely.
Get people focused on the rules so much, you're so scared of making a mistake that
Hmm.
you don't pay attention to other things, such as, what is my faith and what does God want from me? So you're just constantly just paying attention to rules and not breaking them because your clan or your tribe or your group will
Yeah.
then ostracize you for that. So anyway,
Yes.
I just wanted to
So
put that.
that actually also demands conformism from you. So inshallah, maybe at a later sitting, we can talk about how sects work. Sects work in precisely this way. They have these rules of power that they play in trying to keep people remaining within the sect. These are actually very harsh, quite cruel ways of doing that. But yeah, just coming back to my journey. So, I grew up in Pakistan, very kind of ethics oriented understanding of Islam. And then, kind of in my late teens, I started becoming aware of this. But women have inferior intellect. Naqisul Akal, women have inferior faith, Naqisul Deen. That is how the famous hadith used to be translated. Women have been born from the rib of Adam, and they're crooked. So if you try to straighten the rib, it will break. So don't
Fix
try to fix them. Don't try to reason with them. They're irrational anyway. If you reason with them, then some some kind of explosion will happen.
their
So I really
emotions.
started to, yeah, 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 not rational. So all those messages were coming our way, and just like you, I used to sit and think that if Allah has given me inferior intellect, then how come He's enabled me to pinpoint this? Because I could be, if I was subhuman, I could be like an animal with no sense whatsoever of my inferiority. I wouldn't be rationalizing it. I wouldn't be thinking about it intellectually. But the fact that He's given me that thought, the ability to think that thought, but then also if Allah is Al Hakam, so He's a judge, a fair judge, and he's al-adl. So the interesting thing here is Allah does not say that I'm adil or possessing of the quality of justice. I am justice. It's
Mm-hmm.
an absolute. Saying that Allah is al-adl
Mm-hmm.
means that he is absolute justice. So if Allah is absolutely fair, then how can he commit this unfairness? So rationally, it doesn't make sense. So
And
I
you
was,
also mentioned something else, which was very interesting, Sitara, when we were talking, that if I am of inferior
yeah.
intellect, then why would I be judged the same?
Exactly. And the levels of accountability as well are similar.
Accountability,
So yeah, so if, for example, if let's say a 15-year-old, God forbid, a child dies young at the age of 15, Allah will judge that child accordingly. The 15-year-old is immature, may have made some bad decisions, but he's a child. But if women are also the same and women have an inferior intellect, then if Allah, and we have to obviously always agree that Allah is the fairest of judges, then he
yes.
would have also have given us some mitigation.
Yeah.
He would have said your punishment is half of the punishment of a man because your
That
intellect
makes
is
you
half
stupid.
of the,
Yeah.
yeah, because you're stupid and you can't get your head around these things. I'm going to be very lenient towards you. Diminish responsibility. In the justice system, this is called diminished responsibility. You have
Exactly.
diminished responsibility because you just can't get your head around this and you're just silly. So, in the absence of that, what happens is it creates these contradictions when we try to connect with the Quran. And it took me a long time actually to join the dots and understand what was happening. So, if it's okay, if I can give a longish answer here, Erin, because I think this is an
Please,
important
please, of
question.
course. Yes.
I, I
Yeah.
think what I'm going to do is start with the idea, which I think is often not presented to Muslims, is the idea of the fact that knowledge is created. So knowledge is like cake. Okay, we see the cake, which is the end product. Somebody cracks some eggs, put some butter in, put some flour, sugar, vanilla essence, or whatever, and then uses a process to produce an end product, right? Which is cake.
Mm-hmm.
Now, when we are told something, because we haven't been taught to think critically, I'm not judging anyone because we're just not taught in our education systems, because we're not taught to think critically. When a piece of information reaches us and it's religious information, we think it's the truth.
Mm-hmm.
So, for example, there are many examples. Might say, okay, um, women are inferior in intellect. We receive it as truth.
Mm-hmm.
Now we're trying to make sense of that truth. It doesn't make sense, but we're thinking, okay, this is what Islam says, I have to accept. Or we're told that women must be subordinate to men in a marriage, right? So the guy is boss and the wife is his subordinate, right? So
Mm-hmm.
this is kind of the patriarchal view of marriage. You say, okay, this is what the Quran says, that a devout wife is also an obedient wife. We receive it as truth. We also have some other truths. For example, Islam says a woman must stay in the house. We receive these as truths. Now, what they are, in fact, are opinions and interpretations, and they have been arrived at through a process of interpretation, of knowledge creation. So, a scholar has taken some stuff from the Quran, taken some stuff from Hadith, from his culture, from his customs, from his own conditioning. He has made some assumptions about that knowledge. He's then presented it as an opinion. So I'll give you an example. You would have heard, most people here in the audience today would have heard this, that all of a woman is aura, that all of a woman is nakedness. It's a terrible, terrible word. That all of a woman is defective. She's nakedness. She's a private part. She's genitalia, right? Therefore, she must always be covered because this is something genitalia shameful. So all of the women must be covered, right? Everybody. So if you go to any traditional kind of, if you listen to any traditional preacher, we say, well, all of a woman is an aura, but you must be covered. So we receive it as truth. What it actually is the opinion of Imam al-Badawi, written in the 13th century.
Wow.
Okay. So what Bedawi is
That's
saying
what
is
the word aurat comes from.
that's where the word aurat comes from. It's actually not a nice word. So Al-Baidawi is saying that, and by the way, he also says something else. He says that all of a free woman is aura. So a
Wow.
free woman must cover herself, but the aura of a slave woman is from the navel to her knees.
Wow. The rest of
So
her
a
can be
slave,
naked.
the rest of it can be naked. But what we receive now in the year 2024 is what we see this as received truth that all of a woman is aura, therefore she must cover up. So the reason why I'm pointing that out is that knowledge is created through a process of interacting with the Quran and Hadith and other forms of knowledge. In In Western academia, it's called epistemology, the study of how knowledge is created. Okay, that's what it's called. In
Mm-hmm.
our tradition, it's called usulul fiqh.
Mm-hmm.
So usulul fiqh are the principles that you use to extract knowledge from Quran and Hadith. I'll give you an example. One of the principles in Islam is that Quran is the revealed word of God. And because it is the revealed word of God, it is absolute truth and it's certain. It's
Mm-hmm.
certain knowledge. Okay, now this is an usul. So we start a process of interpretation, and that process of interpretation takes a principle that we will not question the word of God because it is the word of God. Okay. So what I'm trying to say is, and I've done a tiny little diagram. I don't know how it will show up, but these are my scribbles. Does that show
Yeah,
up properly?
you can see it.
Okay. You
And
can
we'll put
see
it
it?
up in editing, we'll put it up on the screen.
Okay, I'll send that to you. So Professor Khalid Abul Fadl, I've put him down as Kaif. Here's Professor Khalid Abul Fadl's kind of explanation. So the author,
You're going from the top?
yeah. So at the top, you'll see the author of the Quran is Allah,
Mm-hmm.
right? The Quran is read by a human being, that is you, me, men, women, children. And the text of the Quran is available to us, but that text was put down about 1400 years ago. So we have to understand what that text means. We have to take a process. And when we change as a reader, that's what the dotted line is for. That if I change as a reader, I become more mature, I go through some hardship in life, I get older, I move to a different country. My reading of the Quran and the same text will change,
Yeah, you're on this side now. Okay.
right? So the point I'm trying to make is that when you create knowledge, this movement is always happening
Yeah.
between the reader and the text as they're trying to understand that text. Okay, so when our scholars from 1,000 years ago are living in a highly patriarchal society, it is very easy for them to say that a woman is subordinate to a man
Mm-hmm.
because that's what they see around them. But for us who live in, for example, a human rights based framework in the modern world, right, the United States says that humans have rights and men and women are equal. So gender should not imply inequality, right? So when I read the Quran, I'm going to try to look for equality in the Quran. This will happen because I'm a product of my
That,
times. We're all
yes.
bound. We're all bound by the culture, the morality, the sensibilities that we have. So the same Quran is read differently by every generation of Muslims. That is the beauty of the Quran, that it's read differently. Okay. So the point I'm trying to make is somebody's asked a question as well about what I mean by aura. All I'm saying is that what we're receiving as truth, that somebody has said that all of a woman is naked and should cover herself, is actually the opinion of a scholar. And that scholar lived 700 years ago.
Yeah.
So we may or may not agree with his opinion. So we have to delve into the Quran itself and find that opinion and see if it agrees with the Quran. Because the Quran is the furqan, it is the criterion between truth and falsehood. So we have to test it. So what happens when knowledge is
Sitara,
created?
I just want to
Sorry.
ask you a question
Yeah.
before we go forward. So obviously, so somebody in the 600 years ago would have read the Quran, interacted with the Quran, understood the Quran differently because of what they were accustomed to, and we're looking at it from a different point of view. Uh, how do we know how the
Mm.
Sahaba interpreted the Quran? That I guess that's the only important thing, right?
Mhm.
Because how
Yeah.
did the Prophet ﷺ, show through example what Quran actually meant?
Yeah.
That would be the only important thing to pay attention to then.
Absolutely. But then in that interpretation, did they class something as deen or not, a religious responsibility or not?
Mm.
That is also important. So, for example, Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam did not class gardening as a religious responsibility,
Mm-hmm.
right? So, gardening is not a religious responsibility. So, we have to when we go back to the example of the Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam and his Sahaba, we then look at which of their opinions have to do with Deen.
Mm.
This is actually encapsulated in a very famous hadith, and this is found in both Bukhari and Muslim, where the people of Medina who were growing date palm trees
Yes.
asked the Prophet if they could graft the tree. And he said, go on and graft the tree. But when they did the grafting, which is where you combine the shoots of two trees, the fruit wasn't great. The fruit yield dropped. So they came to the Prophet and said, you asked us to graft, and then the fruit yield has dropped. And the Prophet said, yes, but I'm not a farmer. I'm a prophet of God. So you
Yeah.
don't have to take farming advice from me. So
Yeah.
when we look at what the Sahaba and Prophet Muhammad Sallallahu Alaihi Wasallam are telling us, we also have to look at what they're telling us about Deen.
Yeah.
So I suppose the point I'm trying to make is here, when women, particularly women, are receiving all these messages as truths, and that sends an alarm bell in your head that, oh my God, this does not sound fair. And God is a fair God, and this just does not sit right with me. Please follow that feeling. Please
Mm.
follow that feeling and follow it through and do your research until you're satisfied. So, coming back to that point about agency of women, then, once you start looking at the Quran, once you start understanding that there's a difference between the revealed word of God and an interpretation of the revealed word of God. These are two different things.
Yeah.
Then you can go back and you can then critique those interpretations. You can play around with them. You can look at different views of people and then decide, okay, this one seems to me to be the closest to the Quran. This seems to be the closest to the Prophet's Sunnah and his uswa, his noble example. So, for example, we do not find anything in the Prophet's example of him ever speaking harshly to a woman, ever
Mm-hmm.
telling a woman what to wear, ever judging her for her appearance, and he was never harsh towards his wives. He never hit his wives. This is his uswa. So
Mm-hmm.
then, if somebody says that a man is allowed to hit his wife, you think, well, hang on a minute. What is the Prophet's uswa here? What is
Mm.
his example? In
Exactly.
fact, he said that the best of men are those who treat their family, their women in the best manner.
Yeah.
So when you start seeing contradictions like that, please follow them through. If you have a sense of unease, don't dismiss it. Why? Because Allah has given us all a fitra. That fitra is, what is it? That fitra is Allah blowing a soul into our bodies. In
Mm.
the Quran, when he says he's created all of us, he breathes into us. When he breathes into us, some divine qualities enter us. One of those divine qualities is an innate sense of right and wrong. We call it fitra. That is
Yeah.
why we say Islam is the deen, a religion of fitra. It's aligned to your nature, inherent nature. So if you get that sense of unease, and I'm sitting there thinking, I really love God, I'm not going to stop. This is me like a 17, 18-year-old. I really love God. I'm not going to stop loving God because he's my kind of lifeline. I rely on him so much. I love him. This is my relationship with him. So I have to find another explanation for
Yeah.
why I'm hearing all of this ugliness and unfairness about women. And this was throughout my life. Throughout my life, I'm 46 soon. This is the quest that has taken me forward, is I want to make sense of it. So kind of my longish answer. But now then, let me just come back to the agency of women, right? How do we claim agency? How do we claim agency? Why is my opinion, why do I say that my opinion and my reading of the Quran is just as valid as a man's reading of the Quran? In fact, I would say that in this day and age, Muslim women's reading of the Quran is much more important. And it's because we're an oppressed half of the ummah. And because we're oppressed, we always gravitate towards verses in the Quran which are about compassion and emancipation.
Mm.
So our reading of the Quran is a freedom oriented reading of the Quran.
Mm.
And when I say agency, what it means is that a person who has free will, Allah has given free will to men, Allah has given free will to women.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. So as a believer, I have the right to read the Quran. This is what I mean by agency. I have the right to read the Quran and make sense of it for myself. And I don't have to go and seek validation from a male scholar.
Yeah.
Okay, that's my agency, that's my right, because Allah has given me that right. And Allah has created me just as beautiful as he has created a man, because Allah Ta'ala says, I think it's Surah Al-Teen. Yes, in Surah Al-Teen, Allah Ta'ala says that we have created man in the best of molds. We've created insan, essen. We've created it's an
That's
insan.
great.
لَقَدْ خَلَقْنَا الْإِنسَانَ أَحْسَنَ تَقْوِيمٍ. We've created insan in the best of molds. So human beings, women and men, have been created in the best of molds, right? The Quran also tells me in Surah Nisa. Now, Surah Nisa is a chapter which is actually about women. It's titled Women. And the first verse in the Quran, in that chapter, is absolutely the most crucial for women in claiming their agency, because that verse is doing a few things. Now, that verse, if you allow me, I'll just read it out because I think it's very
Yeah.
important.
Please.
So, mankind, reverence your guardian Lord who created you from a single person and created of like nature his mate, and from them he scattered like seeds countless men and women. So reverence Allah, through whom you demand your mutual rights, and reverence the wombs that bore you.
Hmm.
For Allah ever watches over you. This is Surah Nisa. And interestingly, in that surah, the Arabic term used is nafsin wahidatin,
Hmm.
one nafs. So from one nafs, whatever that spiritual being, that human being is, its mate has been created.
Hmm.
So the Quran says, and the Quran is doing something interesting here. The Quran is actually taking aim as well at the Judeo Christian belief. And by the way, it's important for me to say that here, that the belief that the woman is born from the crooked rib of Adam and that Eve tempted Adam to eat the fruit of the tree are Judeo Christian doctrines, they're Judeo Christian beliefs. The Quran is taking aim at them straight away. And the Quran is saying, I have created both Adam and his mate. Eve's name is not mentioned. Adam and his mate from the same nafs.
Hmm.
So men and women are literally the same substance of creation.
Hmm.
Okay, so that's your equality right there in creation.
Hmm.
Then Allah tells us that he's also given us spiritual equality, equality in faith, and he does that in Surah Al-Azab. This is chapter 33, ayat 35.
Mhm.
And this actually ties back to that question that we were saying as well, Iram, about accountability.
Mhm.
Yeah, that
Mhm.
there's equality and there's equal accountability. Allah says for Muslim men and women, for believing men and women, for devout men and women, for true men and women, for men and women who are patient and constant, for men and women who humble themselves, for men and women who give in charity, for men and women who fast, for men and women who guard their chastity, and for men and women who engage much in Allah's praise. For them has Allah prepared forgiveness and great reward. So
Mhm.
here is my spiritual equality. I had creation equality
Mhm.
when Adam and Eve are created. And then I have spiritual equality. And then Allah is saying, and I have created you in the best of molds. So if a man has been created in the best of molds, a woman has also been created in the best of molds. So that tells you that in Allah's eyes, there is no bias around gender.
Mhm.
Okay, but I want to compare that, and this is important. I'm just going to compare that a little bit with some of the things that our scholars have said. And Nikat Satar, by the way, in her book, um, she cited actually in a book, Feminism in Islam, contextualizing equality of gender in Islam. And Nikat Satar writes this. This is really interesting. This is how see how scholars are approaching these, right? These are the truths that reach us. So the scholars are saying Bedawi states that men are in charge of women as rulers are in charge of their subjects.
Mhm.
God has preferred God has preferred one sex over the other. Now, if I'm doing critical thinking, I would stop right there and say, well, that's not what Surah Nisa said.
Mhm.
But look what the scholar is saying, because God has preferred men over women in the completeness of mental ability, good counsel, complete power in the performance of duties and the carrying out of divine commands. Hence, to men has been confined prophecy. So, a male scholar is saying that prophecy is confined to men, religious leadership, saintship, the performance of religious rites, the giving of evidence in law courts, the duties of the holy war and worship in the mosque on Friday, the privileges of electing chiefs, the larger share of inheritance, and discretion in the matter of divorce by virtue of what they spend of their wealth in marrying women, such as their dowers, and they bear the cost of their maintenance. So you can see that in our scholars' viewpoint, the hierarchy of creation was different. The hierarchy of creation was Adam was created, he's perfection.
Mhm.
His mate Eve was created from his crooked rib. So she is, as you were saying earlier, subhuman.
Mhm.
And she's deficient in intellect. This is why she gets less in inheritance. She gets less, her witness and testimony isn't worthy, her counsel isn't worthy, and Allah has not given her prophecy.
Mhm.
So we have all of this onslaught of opinions. And I want to actually stop at prophecy. And I did say it was going to be a longish answer, but I think it's important because we're claiming agency. We're saying that I'm a worthy believer and I'm just as worthy in Allah's eyes. So, in terms of prophecy as well, there is a massive misunderstanding. So, at the time that Allah was still sending prophets and messengers, right? We know how harsh society was, and we know that many of Allah's messengers were actually persecuted. Many of Allah's prophets were actually killed. There are verses in the Quran where Allah says, why did you unjustly kill my prophets?
Yeah. We know Hazrat Yahya for sure was killed.
We've seen what happened with Hazrat Yahya. So Prophecy is a combination of two things. One, you're receiving revelation from God because God chooses to do that. Second, it is a social leadership position. So you're going out to society to preach truth to people. And when you do that, you get a reaction. And that reaction is often violent. We saw that Prophet Muhammad was persecuted, people threw
Yeah.
stones at him.
Yeah.
Now, Allah has not given that leadership responsibility, the social leadership responsibility to women. Because even if men are being killed and persecuted, women who are already unsafe and had to live under the protection of men would not have been able to bear that burden, would have been impossible.
Yeah.
But, and this is where the Quran is revolutionary. Let me take that back to the Quran being revolutionary. The Quran itself gives us examples of women's capacity to receive revelation.
Mm-hmm. Hazrat Musa's mother, for example.
There
Yeah.
you go.
But
And Hazrat
I
Musa's
have
mother,
to say that,
the word wahi is used for Hazrat Musa's mother. The word
there
wahi,
people will do mental gymnastics and verbal gymnastics to say that that was not wahi, that was just ilham, that was just, I mean, it saddens me. But please continue.
wa'awhayna. The Quran is saying
I know
wa'awhayna.
exactly.
Right? So the
Wahi.
Quran is saying that. So this is Surah Al-Qasas, verse 7. And Allah is saying to Prophet Moses' mother that, you suckle thy child, but when you fear about him, cast him into the river, but fear not nor grieve. So that question of Allah Ta'ala is so compassionate towards women, and he knows that a mother is being asked to give away her child, one of the most
Most.
possibly an impossible decision. So what does he do? He reassures her and he says, fear not, grieve, nor grieve, for we shall restore him to you.
Mm,
Right? So not only is she being inspired, and then Maryam alayhi salam, who's mentioned 70 times in the Quran, who takes wahi to her?
mm.
Jibril
Gabriel
alayhi salam.
alayhi salam,
The
yeah.
same, so Gabriel, the same angel who takes wahi to Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam. So there is no issue with the capacity of women to receive revelation from God. God is also talking directly to women, of whom he gives us examples in the Quran. But what he does not give them is the responsibility to go out to society, because that would have been impossible to them. So it's when you start connecting the dots like that in the Quran that you realize that women are just as worthy believers for Allah. They have the same level of accountability in the day of judgment. Allah has given them the same capacity for spirituality, for piety, and He's given them the same intellect to also interpret the Quran and interpret the Sunnah of the Prophet and to create knowledge. And that is something Muslim women did for centuries before they were removed from history and before they were removed from institutions of learning. So I know that's a long answer.
No,
I wanted to.
that's a very necessary one. Thank you so much.
Yes,
And I just want to comment here quickly that there are many things that Allah Ta'ala honored women to be the first. For example, um, Hazrat Khadija being the first believer, Razila Ta'ala anha. Hazrat, um, I'm forgetting her name, the first Shaheed, Hazrat, uh, I'm forgetting her name, but Sahabiya who was a slave. She was the first Shaheed of Islam. She was Abu Jahal's slave. Maybe somebody else will remind me, but there were many firsts that were given to women, and even in scholarship, for example, we know that the first mufti was Hazrat Aisha radhiyallahu ta'ala anha. People, even
that's
the
right.
even our revered Sahaba and the caliphs used to go to her. And actually, I think it was in one of your videos that you were talking about it. No, it was another really powerful Muslim voice that I'm going to be hosting on this platform. Daisy was talking about it. That, when Allah Ta'ala ordered the wives of the Prophet to stay indoors because they're not like other women. So what did they do? They engaged in the tradition of knowledge, the learning,
Mhm.
and spreading knowledge. So that was really beautiful. I loved your answer. I don't know if
Mm.
Natasha, if you have any questions that you want to send me. Uh, Let me read you some comments. Hazrat Sumaya, thank you so much, Madiha. It
Yeah,
was Hazrat
thank you.
Sumaya who was the first Shaheed. Maliha has been waiting for this talk for a long time. Sitara, she's one of your fans, and she said, I didn't even realize that it almost 1 hour had passed. Awesome. Well, we are hoping that we will be able to do some groundwork in an hour more. Somehow, women's spiritual journeys, productivity is more faster and more than a man. All right. Well, that's an opinion, and you are welcome to have it. So I don't see any questions right now. I think people are following along,
Mhm.
and
I think there may be a question in there about the testimony of
testimony. I saw that. Do you
women.
want to cover it now, or do you want to cut? Because there are more questions on that I want to.
I'm happy to very briefly talk about that. The testimony of women is, and this is where kind of, because it's my area, to read about debt and usury and lending and the prohibition of riba in Islam. The testimony verses actually appear in the Quranic discussion about debt or lending. So people often see the Quran as a jumble of verses, a disparate set of verses which have just been brought together. The
Mhm,
Quran has very beautiful coherence to it. And the Quran also has a context which is historical, but the Quran also has internal context as well. Okay, so the Quran builds an argument. It doesn't just throw things in, it builds an argument. So, in the case of the whole discussion about usury, the argument actually starts from verse 245 in Surah Al Baqarah, where Allah starts talking about giving charity to those in need. So, the whole discussion is about infaq or charity.
mhm,
And then from verse 275 onwards, there are specific instructions about exploitative types of loans.
mhm,
Okay. Following on from those verses, Allah actually gives Muslims a recommendation. The recommendation was to write the contract of debt.
mhm.
Why? Because if you don't remember, in Arabia, people did not know how to write.
Yeah.
And also, the paper
Paper
was not
wasn't,
available.
paper
Paper
wasn't
wasn't available. So you
invented.
had to write on parchment, you had to write on dried and stretched goat skin. It was very difficult to do. But Allah makes a recommendation that, especially if you're out traveling, write this down. Why? Because people can forget, memories can be faulty, disputes can occur. So the Quran is actually taking a very common sense view, and people often forget this bit of the verse. The first thing that the Quran says is that get two male witnesses. Now, I could argue that men's intellect is flawed because you could just have one male witness,
And it should
but the
be
Quran,
enough.
and that should be enough. So the Quran is actually asking for two male witnesses. Why? And this is again an established principle in justice system as well, that you try to get more than one witness. Why? Because they can corroborate each other.
Hmm.
Simple
Otherwise,
as that.
yeah, his word against the other.
Otherwise, it's one person's memory. And by the way, human memory is incredibly faulty. People
Yeah,
think the human memory is great. It's not. So the
yeah.
Quran says get two men. If you can't find two men, then get two women. Get a man and get two women. And one may forget, so ask her to bring another one with her. Now, this is actually a support mechanism. It's what we would call a reasonable adjustment because women did not used to go out. Women did not used to engage in trade because trade was very unsafe. Women could not travel further distances. So they would very rarely engage in contractual forms of ownership or lending. Okay, women were not doing these negotiations. So Allah is saying that if one of them forgets or makes an error because they don't deal with it very often, she can take another person with her because that person would be able to corroborate her testimony.
Also,
Now,
social pressure, Sitara. There can
and
be,
social pressure, it's terrifying for women to go into,
yeah, it's just,
courts
you
of
have to
law
remember
or,
exactly again the condition, the environment that this is being revealed in, where just a few years ago women were treated as animals, they were property of men. So
yeah.
now that Quran has come and said, okay, you're equal, you have these rights, but there's a lot of conditioning that has already happened. So if there are
Mhm,
women who are not bold, so there's such a huge difference when I'm talking to my students who are, raised in the West versus
mhm,
women raised in Pakistan. I can already see the difference, the level of
yeah.
confidence, and you know. So
Mhm,
Islam is mindful of that also, that these women just got emancipation, but that doesn't mean that their conditioning has changed. So
yeah.
in order to again have support, you can feel a little bit more bold,
Yeah.
if you will, when you have the
Yes, have a
support of
buddy.
a woman.
Have a
Yeah,
buddy. It's a
buddy,
buddying
exactly,
system.
to support you.
It's
It does
as
not mean you're too dumb. Therefore, if,
no.
if you're, I mean, Islam is a deen of hikmat. So anybody with normal brain cells would be like, if you're a human, Sitara, and compared to you, a cat, let's say, or a chimpanzee is of less intellect, then having two chimpanzees be versus you doesn't make any sense because they're
No,
still
no, it doesn't.
chimpanzees.
Because
Yeah,
if you're deficient, you're deficient. It's not going to
efficiently.
make any sense.
So,
Absolutely.
yeah, two
So
of you
it's a
are not going to
budding system.
separate you.
Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah, exactly. It's a budding system. Now, somebody has already put in the comments here about, well, what if a woman is raped or something like that? A crime happens. Again, this is a very important, very, very good observation. These verses are not about a crime happening. When you write a contract down, you're actually getting witnesses to the contract. They are people of your choosing. So you go and you find two credible witnesses, people who are of good moral standing, and ask them to witness your contract for you. When a crime happens, it is not pre planned. It can just happen. A murder, a sexual assault, a rape can just happen. Whoever then is there as witness is the witness. Does
Hmm.
that make sense? Those are two completely different situations. God is not talking about the committing of a crime. He's actually talking about finding two people who can evidence some documentation for you. Now, the person who very astutely pointed this out is Imam Ibn Taymiyyah.
Hmm.
He wrote about this. He wrote about this and he said that our scholars' traditional understanding is wrong. And if you really want to get into the power politics of this, then Professor Muhammad Fadil, I think he's based in McGill University in Canada. He's written a brilliant paper on this halving of testimony of women. And he shows that by taking this verse out of context, what was achieved was that women were prevented from becoming qadi or court judges,
Hmm.
because at that time being a court judge was a very influential political position. You had to be friends with the caliph. You had to be friends with the caliph because he'll appoint you. And
Hmm.
what happened was the scholars then said, because a woman's testimony is not worthy, therefore she cannot listen to testimony, and therefore she can also not be a court judge because court judges listen to testimony. So what happened was that women were removed from kind of the whole justice system, from playing any part in becoming court judges or becoming politically influential. But this is the verse being taken completely out of context. You can open the Quran now and read it. The Quran is very clear. If you're out traveling, you contract a debt, make sure you write it down. Get two witnesses from among yourselves, so people you know who are of good moral standing, two men. If not two men, then one man and two women. And let the scribe also write it down in fairness and not change the contract when he's writing it down. Because if I'm somebody who's not literate, I don't know how to read and write, I'm trusting on a notary to do this for me. The notary might just put something dodgy in there. So Allah saying to the scribe, make sure that you write down what is being said to you and be fair. So this is the set of verses. But because our scholars had not developed those methodologies to look at the Quran in its entire coherent context, they just pulled that verse out, and that was then used to eventually reduce the political role of women.
Hmm.
And it is an absolute atrocity that that was done. But as I said, my argument here is not new. Imam Ibn Taymiyyah said this centuries ago, and he said it's a complete misunderstanding of this verse, because the verse is not talking about any crimes being committed at all. It's not about shahada in the sense of what we say in Urdu, gawahi, being in a court of law and giving your account of a crime. This
Hmm.
is about notarizing a piece of paper and two people saying, yes, I'm witness to the fact that these people owe £50 to each other.
And even I would say, when I help victims of domestic violence, Sitara, even to this day there are so many women, even in America, American women, not just Pakistani women living in America, where I would ask, if I'm going to help them go through the divorce proceedings, how much money does your husband make, and they say, I have no idea. So
Mm,
this, just 50 years ago in America, women could not even open an account, right? So traditionally women have been held back, as we were talking, you and I, that women typically, you won't see them in finance, especially Muslim women.
yeah.
You and I perhaps are exceptions in that. You are that's your background, is finance, and I have delved into that too, but typically you won't see them in those fields, and we're talking about almost 1500 years ago. So
Yes.
hopefully that answers that question. I just want to
Mhm.
quickly address, somebody's asking if we will talk about Surah Nisa at number 34. That's going to probably need a whole
Yeah.
talk. So if we have time, maybe you can just comment on it at the end a little
Yeah.
bit, because there's important things in that ayah to unpack. But maybe Sitara can give her opinion on it at the end. But somebody's asking me, can you also talk about hijab once and for all? Tell us, is it mandatory
Just
or
settle
not?
this forever.
Yeah, maybe we should go into that. And like I said, I have
Uh-huh.
some other questions that my students have sent me. If you want me to ask those now, I can ask them
Mhm.
now, or do you want to cover the hijab issue first?
Shall we look at the hijab issue first, simply because somebody's already asked that in the audience, and then we can come back
Let's
to the
put that in.
questions you have, if that's okay with you, Iran? Yeah.
Yeah, please, please.
So, yeah. So settling, I can't settle anything. I'm a scholar, I'm a researcher, I'm a student of Islam. All I can do is share with you my understanding.
Yeah, and
And
then
that understanding can be flawed, but this is where my understanding is at the moment. And I can tell you that in the last 20 years of living and breathing kind of Islamic legal reasoning, that my views do change, and they should change, because when new evidence comes to light, your views change. My journey has been a journey of change. I never used to wear the hijab. Uh, I came from a middle class Pakistani family. We were told to dress modestly, and modesty meant wearing a loose tunic with shalwar, the baggy trousers that we wear, and wearing a shawl or a dupatta around our shoulders. That's it. Nobody ever said that your hair was sinful. I don't understand when people say, hair, what is wrong with hair? I mean, men have gorgeous hair. I often say to people, oh, okay, so you notice women's hair, maybe you should see Brad Pitt in Legends of the Fall and see how much we loved his hair, his
yeah,
gorgeous long golden locks. So men also have attractive hair. So that's not the argument that the Quran is making, because men also have hair and women also have hair. So I don't think that that's
yeah.
the
If
that's
you
the
go to
argument.
Pakistan now, you'll see it in a second because men now pay a lot of attention to their grooming.
Oh yeah, yeah, yeah,
Beard
yeah.
and hair, it makes such a huge difference. And for
Absolutely. Just today, my sons were saying that they want to buy this Philips grooming kit or something, which is 150 pounds. And I said, yes, when you have a job, save up and then you can buy it. Do not ask me to fund this for you. And they said, oh, maybe this could be our birthday present. So I think they're going to try some emotional blackmail. But yes, this is the thing, women and men have hair. That's not what the Quran is saying. The thing with hijab is that it's not mentioned in the Quran. The word hijab as a covering is not mentioned in the Quran. The Quran mentions hijab as a curtain in a couple of instances. Once it mentions it as a curtain that the Prophet drew just outside his house to designate the kind of the line, the boundary between what is public and private.
he
Like
didn't have
we now,
a door. Yeah.
he didn't have a door. Now we have doors. So he pulled the curtain down. And the Quran also uses hijab as something of the unseen. So the Quran says that Allah speaks to his messengers and his prophets from behind a veil.
Hmm.
Allah never directly talks to human beings, by the way. He either talks to them from behind a veil. So Musa alayhi salam never saw Allah. He did hear a voice. He never saw him, never encountered him directly.
Allah spoke directly to Hazrat Musa, though, right?
Hazrat Musa, but still the Quran says from behind a veil. So what that experience, it's a matter of the unseen. We don't know what that experience was, because Allah says in the Quran that one of the rewards of dying a Muslim and going to Jannah is that we'll be able to see his face. So
Yeah.
nobody's seen it. The other thing is that Allah always sends revelation, and he says that he sends revelation either from behind a veil or through his angels. So Jibril will bring revelation, right? There is always kind of a barrier. So the word hijab in the Quran is used in that sense, never in the sense of women's clothing. So the discussions around women's clothing are found, and please do watch my videos on Surah Al-Azab
I
and
was
Surah
going to
Nur,
mention this that
because they're very long and
yeah,
detailed.
maybe
So
do a very brief overview of this because it's
yeah,
going to require. Sitara has 4 videos on this subject that I have been watching. Each is about an hour long, I
yeah,
think. So there's a lot of background, history, context, what was going on before Islamic times. Women, so uh, niqab was not something that came with Islam. Actually, it had been practiced before that, but
yeah.
not for the sake of piety, but to show a class distinction. So, slave girls who were used for as sexual slaves as well for prostitution were actually, it was illegal for them to cover even their hair or
Yes,
wear niqab. They would be punished for doing that. But women of class could do that, and actually they did do it because now they were under the protection of a man of
that's
higher
right.
stature. So it was really all about the politics, the class status, and because women were still considered property of men. So if they were
That's
the
right.
property of a powerful man, then they had protection from that man. So that was the historical background. And so those of you that want to watch that in detail, and I really encourage you to do that, because here's the thing, like Sitara said, Sitara is not here to give you the verdict on whether hijab is mandatory or not. I'm not here to do that either. I've resisted this for almost 5 years with you guys, because you kept asking me, why do you talk about Allah but you don't cover yourself? Why do you talk about Quran and you don't? And I just kept resisting it, because frankly, for me, that has never been when I talk about oppression of women, although I do feel that this was part of the oppression, that this started to happen. But right now, I had more important things to talk about for women, right? Like, if you want to do hijab, good for you. If you don't want to do it, good for you, but don't force others to, adhere to your opinion. That's more important here.
Mhm.
So make up your own mind. Go and watch Sitara's videos. They're on her channel, Sitara Akram, and you will find the details there. We will cover some of it today, but ultimately, it needs to be your decision. Nobody has the right to tell you what you should do. And if your heart is saying one thing, like Sitara said, please pay attention to that voice in your heart, because usually it will lead you to the truth. But if you're just doing it because this is what my family expects of me, and this is what my sect expects of me, or my husband, or whatever, then please know that you're not doing it for Allah. You're doing it for those reasons, and that's fine too, because maybe that's what makes you comfortable and stuff. But don't sit on judgment on other women. And if you have decided, you've done your research, and you are convinced that Allah wants you to do hijab or niqab, whatever it is that Allah wants you to do, and you want to do it, all the power to you. It's your right to decide to do that. But please do not think that somehow you are better than other women who are not doing it, who have also sincerely researched, then they have come to the conclusion, no, this is not necessary. Because I find
Mm.
that's another way to divide and conquer. Just
Yeah.
divide these women so they will hate each other, and they will never band together to actually do what is more important, which is to fight for your agency and autonomy, right?
Mm.
That's what your right is. So I'm sorry to interrupt, but please continue. You were going to say something.
Yes, no, thank you for that background. And as you were saying, absolutely, if you want to listen to kind of the whole historical background to the practice of veiling, please do have a look at the videos on my channel, because I go into a lot of detail and I go back a few thousand years to explain that the practice started amongst Greek aristocratic women. And the idea of veiling was that aristocratic women could then be identified very quickly from women who had to be economically active and had to go out of the house, or women who were sex slaves and they were offering their services in prostitution. So you could quickly identify which women were under the protection of a man and which women had their services available for all men. That is how historically veiling was practiced. When it comes to Islam, at the time of Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam, there was very much this is a very highly sexualized and promiscuous society, and the rules for dress and nakedness were very different. Okay, the way now we wear clothes, and clothes are cheaper, comparatively cheaper. At that time, even having an extra shawl
It
was
was
very
very
expensive.
expensive. Yeah.
Very clothing was extremely expensive, and actually you will find that there's a lot of research also around how clothing and slavery are linked. So
Mm.
in America, for example, where the African American community lived under slavery for such a long period of time, they were actually given a dress code and a certain type of clothes to wear on the plantations where they worked,
Mm.
because they were not allowed to wear the same clothes as their masters would wear. You see,
Mm.
so it's a form of distinction. So when the verses in the Quran are revealed, the aristocratic women in Arabia had the habit of flaunting themselves, both their wealth and the jewelry, but also their bodies. And they would often wear a vest which would be open at the front. So they would cover the top, but they would wear a vest that would be open at the front, so the cleavage would show. It was a very careless way of dressing. There was also another particular type of vest that they used to wear, which would be unsewn from the sides. So your body would be exposed from the sides. And women who engage in prostitution used to wear kind of the skirt where they would have a kind of like a seam, a split seam running all the way up their thigh, so their legs would show. And that was their way of kind of, saying to people, look how desirable I am, pay money for this.
Yeah.
So, and also women were actually auctioned as slaves for their physical form and beauty. So when the Quran is revealed, a couple of things were happening. One, There's a particular set of verses in Surah Al-Ahzab, which is about Prophet Muhammad's wives and the women in his family who were being harassed by people in Medina. And Allah says that they must wear an outer garment. So don't just go out of your house wearing the clothes that you normally wear in the house, but actually wear an outer garment. And then you will be distinguished. You'd be identified as not being of slave women.
Mhm.
So the hypocrites of Medina who are using that as an excuse, and they say, well, we can't tell them apart, can we? We just thought they were all slave women, and therefore we're having, we're harassing them. So that excuse was taken away from them. So the purpose of wearing the jilbab was to identify the women of Muslim households. In that
People
context,
would
where
know,
that identification worked,
huh?
in that context, and where that identification had a meaning.
Yes, that's what I was
So,
going to say. That
yeah.
again, we really need to understand that this is a society where women are typically property of men. Even men needed the protection of their tribal background because this was a very warring kind of violence ridden times, and that was the state in pretty much the entire
Mhm.
world. And then you also have slave women that could be raped, tortured, harassed, whatever, because they didn't belong to any men.
They had no rights. They had no rights.
They had no
Slavery is
right.
about not having rights. Yeah.
Exactly. So they had
Yeah.
no rights. And then you have these Muslim women that are, going outside to relieve themselves using the bathroom.
Mm.
They didn't have bathrooms indoors. So, and that's where the hypocrites are harassing them. And we already know about some instances where, because they were trying to hurt the prophethood, the
Yes.
journey of prophethood, they had tried all different means. They had also
Mhm.
harassed Prophet Sallallahu Alaihi Wasallam directly. Then they put that buhtan on Hazrat Aisha radiallahu ta'ala anha.
Mhm.
So any which way to discredit
Yes.
Prophet Sallallahu Alaihi Wasallam and
And
his
hurt him.
and
And
hurt
hurt him.
him. And so now they're finding other ways to go around and hurt him through his family or discredit his family. So all of that is going on. And then
Mhm.
when they're asked, why are you bothering our women? They say, well, we don't know if they're slave
Mhm.
women or they're women under your protection. We don't recognize it. So that's when this hukum comes in, that, cover yourselves so that you're distinguished, you're different from
Yes. You
the
can be
or
identified.
you can be
Yeah.
identified. So you're
It's a
not
measure
being,
for identification. Yeah.
so that they
Absolutely.
no longer have an excuse. Yeah.
That's right. And then the verses go on to say that if they don't desist, then Prophet Muhammad SAW has the right to take action against them.
Mm.
And so Asma Barlas, in her book Believing Women in Islam, absolutely highly recommended. Please read. Asma Barlas has pointed this out, that the verse of the jilbab only works if in society you have jahili men, ignorant men.
Love that part. Oh my
And
God.
I love that, because actually, why do women need protection in the first place? Because the men are misbehaving.
Yeah.
The problem is not with the women, the men are misbehaving. So the fact that women need to wear particular types of clothes to say to men, don't misbehave towards me, means that there are too many misbehaving men in society. That jahili, that age of ignorance, the age of jahiliya mentality, that once a woman is out of the house, she's fair game. And unfortunately, this is what we see in Pakistan, where I'm from. It's a Muslim country, but my God, the level of harassment all of us face in that country is astonishing.
Even if
So
you're
they are
very,
behaving like, doesn't
yeah,
matter, because
yeah.
their behavior is of jahili men, and that's the point, isn't it? Because if you have jahili men around you, it doesn't matter how you dress, that's not going to protect you. But in Prophet's time, the purpose of that protection was that it would distinguish Muslim women from slave women, because slave women dress differently. Okay. Then you have the verses in Surah. So those are specific verses in Surah Al-Azab. Those verses also say, they start by saying in that paragraph that Prophet's wives, you are not like other women. So there are going to be certain rules and regulations that apply to you. They're not going to apply to the women. Surah Al-Azab is very clear on that. Okay. So it's an exceptional set of rulings for that specific period of time for the Prophet's household.
May I
You
make
then have,
a
sorry.
Sitara? Just a comment
Uh-huh.
here. A lot of times I have seen that the interpretation of this is hijacked, and this mindset that I saw in the comment too, this mindset that people have, which is again going to be very radical for you guys to think about, that Islam actually does not place responsibility on a woman for the behavior of men. Islam is not saying that men will be lustful, like this famous words of, men are not robots. Men will be lustful, so therefore responsibility is on you to cover yourself up and appear less attractive to men. This is the prevailing concept of Muslim
Absolutely.
scholarship, and this is totally against Islam, and this is totally
Absolutely.
against what Quran is saying right here. Quran is
Yeah.
placing the onus on the men who are behaving, like you said,
Behaving badly.
jahili men.
Yeah.
And the reason why they were being asked to cover up was to basically counter their argument that they were giving.
Uh-huh.
That's
To
what
stop
Quran
that,
is.
exactly, to take the weight of their argument away from them and say, well, now you can recognize them. What excuse will you use? Right?
Yeah, what
That's
excuse
what
will
the
you
Quran.
use now?
What excuse will you use now? Because they would have carried on persecuting anyway until they were threatened to stop doing that. Then you have the verses of Surah An-Nur, verse 30 and 31, which both start off by saying that both men and women should lower their gaze. And I'll come to the idea of gaze in a second because it's very important, the hikmah behind that. But the Quran, in terms of the rules, says that both men and women should cover their private parts, right? That's essential. And then the other important thing that the Quran mentions in the case of women, it says that just draw your veils over your chest.
Hmm.
Now, the reason why the Quran has to mention that, why did the Quran mention it specifically? Let's say women were already wearing clothes where the chests were covered, they were not flaunting themselves. The Quran would not have to mention it.
Yeah,
The Quran is mentioning it because it wants to change the prevailing practice in that society, which is that women will show off their breasts or show off their cleavage. So the Quran is saying, take a shawl or take a piece of garment or a khimar. Now, the khimar, and this becomes so controversial. And this, by the way, took me an age to understand. The khimar is a head cover, usually worn on the head, not always, but there are plenty of examples from history that the khimar was also put on your shoulder. It was sometimes put around your neck, and it was basically a cover against the intense heat of the sun,
yeah,
which is why men also wear it.
yeah,
Have you seen Arab men? Arab men always wear a khimar, yeah,
yeah.
but it's never mentioned for men ever. It's assumed that only women do. Men and women used to wear a khimar, mostly to protect against the sun. So Allah is saying to women, because women have breasts and men don't. So Allah is saying, take your khimar, cover your chest. So the commandment, and this is where fiqh, understanding a little bit about Islamic legal reasoning, is important, that when Allah commands or prohibits something, He uses a certain type of language. So He says, do not drink alcohol, do not go near gambling, you must say your prayer, you must fast. Here, the positive commandment, the order, the obligation is cover your chest.
Hmm.
Women, cover your chest because you don't. And your chest is a part of your body that will sexualize you. If you expose it, it will sexualize you. And Allah wants men and women to behave with each other with dignity. So
Mm-hmm.
He wants to take the sexual element out of the interaction between men and women.
Mm-hmm.
What our scholars have done is that they have taken that verse and put it into the service of that whole issue around, as you said, divide and rule, who are modest women, who are immodest women, who are practicing. In Britain, there is this word they use, a practicing Muslima and a non practicing Muslima, whatever that means. But this is said a lot here in
So
Britain.
offensive. So offensive.
It's so offensive. What does that mean? So, what that does is when women or men insist that Islam demands some kind of external markers of piety, that's the problem. Islam does not want me to go and proclaim to the rest of the world that I'm a Muslim. I'm a Muslim because of my faith and my good deeds
Mm-hmm.
and my compassion and my orientation towards justice and my faith in the hereafter. That's why I'm Muslim. So, for me, people who say that Muslim women should look a certain way, I always say to them, but then you have to prove to me to the Quran that God demands that as a performance of piety, as piety in action. And the problem with putting the onus of the hijab on women is that it is now doing the opposite of what used to happen in the Jahiliyyah times,
Hmm.
that the hijab is actually putting Muslim women at harm
Mm-hmm.
of Islamophobia and anti-Muslim hatred. So it's flipped. It's completely flipped. And what I would say also here is that if we are to look Muslim, why is that burden only on women? I would say ask the men to also give them a prescriptive style of beard, ask them to wear a particular hat and a particular robe in dark green. So when they go out, they look Muslim, and then they can also pick up the burden of Islamophobia and anti Muslim hatred. It is utterly unfair that this uniform, which is prescribed for women, is only prescribed for women and not for men. So there are a whole host of reasons, and the reason why we have reached this point, Iram, and for the audience here, is because we are very insecure in our identity as Muslims, because our identity has been shattered after 250 years of colonial rule.
Mm-hmm.
And we are now playing out our identity politics through women's bodies.
Mm.
Because when women are dressed in a certain way, then you can point to them and you can then feel very good. And you say, well, I'm going to face the West. The West is my enemy. And I'm going to say to the West, look at your women and look at our women. So you
Mm.
see, so it's a point of distinction that's created because it immediately makes us feel better. Look how wonderful our women are. Your women have done all. By the way, I've lived in this country 18 years. All women that I know here are absolutely lovely, modest women. It is actually very, very rare to come across a woman who's not modest. So
Yeah.
we have now created a problem where this dress code is being prescribed. Now, another argument that's used is that this is how the Salaf Salihin or the great generations of Islam, the first few generations of Islam used to dress. There is no historic evidence for that. And I'm going to suggest for the audience here that there are 5 lectures that Professor Khalid Abul Fadl has given, one of the greatest scholars of our time, by the way, which is why nobody listens to his YouTube videos. You should definitely download his 5, they're audio lectures, and sometimes the audio can be a bit patchy, but please persist, persist, and invest 5 hours of your time into that. He has gone into using historical sources because he's such an amazing scholar. He's got 100,000 books in his own library, and he's got access to rare historical manuscripts. He goes back into them and he
He's
explains
the one who wrote the
exactly.
forward for Lena's book.
He's the one who's written the foreword for Lena's book, and his wife Grace Song is amazing. Grace Song is a convert, and she absolutely leads the work for him. She's director of the Usuli Institute. If there
Wonderful.
is one group, if there's one power couple in Islam with complete integrity, that's them. So
Wow.
Professor Khalid Abul Fadl is the only person I know who has zero time for misogyny and patriarchy. He absolutely sees women as equals. And he has done these 5-hour lectures. His name is Professor Khalid Abu Al Fadl. Actually, I'll show you his book, which is a game changer. And he talks about authoritarian discourses, speaking in God's name, Islamic law, authority, and women. This has probably been one of the most influential books that I've read on the subject of how narratives about women are created. Okay, and how Wahhabism in particular has created certain narratives about women. He's very critical of Wahhabism. So Professor Khalid Abul Fadl has done these lectures. Please listen to them. He really delves into the history, and then he goes into the Arabic because he's an Egyptian. He can access Arabic. He's been to traditional. He's a sheikh. He's had traditional learning. He's also a human rights lawyer and a professor.
Oh,
He's
wow.
he's an absolute genius. And he then goes into the Arabic language of these verses as well. And he actually mentions
Can you
something
repeat
really
his name
interesting.
again, Sitara? Some people missed it. So sorry.
It's Professor, hang on. It's Professor Khalid Abu Al Fadl. Can you see that?
Fadl. Yes, thank you.
Yeah.
And we will put it in the description and stuff
Yes,
when
I can send all
it's
that
recorded.
information
Yeah,
across,
when
not a
it's edited,
problem.
we'll put it in there. And hopefully one day he'll grace my show too. That would be
Oh,
awesome.
it'll be amazing. We can do that. So one of the things he mentions, Iram, is the word juyub mentioned in the verse in the Quran. Now,
Yes.
Allah Ta'ala, of course, he's the best writer. He's a perfect writer. He never makes mistakes. He knows exactly why he's choosing a particular word. He uses the word juyub, which is the plural of jeb, and that comes from the Arabic word for pocket. And when it's said as juyub, it means where two pockets meet. And it is actually a very, Allah Ta'ala uses very graceful words.
Mhm.
So it's a very graceful reference to the point where women's breasts meet, what
Mm.
we call a cleavage today. So the verse uses the word juyub. Your juyub are your zina, and you should hide them
Mm.
with your shawl. That is the commandment in the verse. Everything else, in my view, again, this is my view, everything else is interpretive clutter around that verse. The
Yes.
whole obsession with women's hair and their faces and their voices, and the women's voices become aura. And if you look at the Taliban, what have they done? They have said a woman's voice is an aura. A woman's voice is enticing. So Afghan women are now no longer allowed to speak in public.
Mhm.
Literally, their voices have been taken away from them. So every time you take Sharia rulings out of their original remit where Allah has put them, and you
Mhm.
expand them, you will always create injustice.
And
This
then
is
where does it stop? That's
And
the
where
other
does it stop? Where does
we,
it stop?
you and I were talking about this earlier, and maybe I'll request you to talk about that incident from the prophetic tradition where Sahaba Akram used to go into sajda and their private parts would
Yeah.
show. But wherever when Nabi Karim Sallallahu faced a situation where decency and privacy had to be maintained, he was extra cautious not to put any kind of ruling in place that would restrict the women,
Yeah.
because that was Allah's command. They did not want to restrict women, and it was always done in balance. Now, as you were mentioning, so if we, what you called it, interpretive clutter, I really like that term. So they've done mental gymnastics around
Mhm.
just trying to make sure that they can, bring hair into the situation.
Yeah.
And then, like I said, I made a video couple of years ago, Sitara. I don't know if you had to, if you got a chance to watch it. I don't know if you knew about me then, but because from the day I started making videos and I'm talking about taqwa and tashakkar and how to make your lives better, and but the only comment in the beginning that I used to get was, "How dare you? Don't you know the identity of a Muslim woman and cover
Yeah.
your hair and this and that?" Nonstop, right? And because I was from Dallas and kind of careless, I would sit, I'm used to sitting, as you know, you're in the West. We're
Mhm.
taught how to sit legged, like a
Mhm.
woman should sit, not like a man should sit. So
Yeah.
I had problems with that too. And then my trousers would ride up a few inches, and oh my God,
Oh my God, your ankles.
oh my God, and a little bit of leg. Now,
Yes.
I've always known for years that that's not part of my aura. I know it. But in Pakistan, it was, oh my God, such a big deal. Like, bas, fatwe
Yeah.
aa gaye.
So your credibility is lost.
And my
Your
credibility
credibility is lost.
lost.
Yeah.
And then some people, rightly so, would ask me, okay, even if you don't believe in all this, why don't you just still do it, so that people would listen to you? And I said, well, I can't be inauthentic, and maybe
Yes.
that's why God wants me to do all this stuff. So I'm going to keep
Yeah.
on. So without talking on the subject, this is the first time that I'm actually openly talking about this subject of covering. So without really touching this, I've been, seeding everybody with useful information about how to improve your life, how to build a close relationship with Allah Ta'ala, how to do all of that stuff. But this is very, very important today because the video I made last year, I said, okay, fine, I'll listen to you guys. You want me to listen to you because you won't stop, badgering me with this? Okay, I'll listen to you. Here. So I made a video first. I'm like, okay, is this good enough? I'm just wearing like a dupatta on my head. And then I say, oh, but wait, some of you from different sects are going to say, no, this is not good enough. Not a single hair should show. So let me, so
Mhm.
then you see the next scene and I'm wearing, and then it's like, oh no, but some of you don't like colorful hijab. So maybe it should just be black. And then I keep it, it was a satire. And it ended
Yeah.
up with me wearing glasses and gloves and wearing an abaya, and
Yeah. There's no
eventually
end to it. Yeah.
not eventually not saying anything, and then
Yeah.
there are just words on the screen that say, even some of you will not accept my voice because it's the voice of a namehram, so
That's
maybe I
right.
should just be quiet and just gesture. And
Yeah.
then you just see me doing that on the screen, and it looks ridiculous, and it's meant to look ridiculous, but people got offended.
Yeah.
And
You were subverting. Of course, they got offended.
and yeah, and then the words say, but even this is not acceptable for
Yeah.
some of you, no matter what. So
Yeah.
let me just, and then the screen goes blank. And what it was, it goes dark. What it was meant to show was that if you follow this line of thinking, you are not being a good Muslimah. Under somebody's interpretation, you are still not
Yes.
doing enough. You are not a good Muslimah. And if you keep following, believe me, what they
Mhm.
used to do, they used to bury infant girls alive.
Yeah.
That's where they want to see you. They will see you under the ground, and then they're going to be like, ah, beautiful Muslimah.
Yeah, yeah. Not to be seen, not to be heard. But we're seeing that in a way now, unfortunately and very sadly, we're seeing that, as they call it, nifaz sharia, or implementation of sharia, now happening in Afghanistan. And the first thing they did was to take the right of education away from women.
Mm-hmm.
Then they told them to stay in their homes and abandon their businesses. Then
Mm-hmm.
they told them to wear that hideous shuttlecock burqa. And
Mm-hmm.
now they've said you can no longer take a taxi. A mahram has to be with you, somebody that you know, a family member, and you can no longer speak in public. There is no end to this. It is a slippery slope once you start on it. And there is so much oppression in this because women's life chances and life outcomes are curtailed. And what
Yes.
is horrible is that this is done in the name of Islam.
Yes.
I have absolutely no issues with women wanting to wear a hijab. I wore a hijab for 10 years. Why? Because at that time, this is 2008, 2008 or so, I became convinced that this is what God wanted from me.
Mm-hmm.
I wore it for 10 years. That's not a short period of time. It took me another 2 to 3 years to do enough research to decide to take it off.
Mm-hmm.
And so my positionality on this is very informed on both sides of the argument because I've actually chosen to follow both sides of the argument. But where I stand now is that I firmly believe that the hijab is not mandatory. I think our imaginations have been colonized by a particular version of Islam exported from Saudi Arabia at a particular period in time. They have now changed their views. Suddenly, that Sharia, I always say, oh, the Sharia has changed, has it? Because
Yeah, they're
before,
changing.
before women couldn't drive and they had to wear
Yeah.
these black abayas, and now suddenly the Sharia has changed. Now, the Sharia has not changed. Their opinions about Sharia have changed. And so, what has done is huge damage. And I'll tell you the damage it has done, Iram. One, our young women are so anxious. Why? Because they just feel they're not good enough. No matter how they dress, they're so anxious with their appearance and how Allah will judge them. We've
Mm-hmm.
put all this massive burden on their shoulders. The second thing
If
is
you
that
wear
it's
perfume, let me just mention it quickly. There's so many
yeah,
no's that you cannot do as a woman. If you wear perfume, you're going to hell. If
yeah,
you look pretty, you're
yeah,
going to hell. So some of them, even when they start wearing hijab and then they put makeup on, and
yeah,
now they've got a higher level of anxiety that, oh my God, this is also bad.
exactly.
If you have a nice voice or you talk nicely, if you smile, if you, I mean,
Oh my God,
smiling.
I'm going to hell, Iram, because I smile all the
Well,
time.
and Sitara, it's the sunnah of the Prophet Sallallahu Alaihi
It
Wasallam.
is. Yeah.
Smiling and doing pehel and doing salam is sunnah of the Prophet. So we as women are not allowed to follow the sunnah. We're going to go to hell for that. So there's
Yes.
so many things. And let's not forget, you have to be always and utterly obedient and grateful to your husband, even if he's an abusive man. And guess what? Majority of women are going to hell because they're ungrateful. Like, so you see all this
Mm.
oppression and rules that women have to follow, and you're constantly scared because it's like, oh my God, if I make this mistake, I'm going to hell. If I make, like,
Yeah.
I don't even want to get started. Like, um, I just did a video on somebody in America who got a settlement in her divorce, and then she was approached by her family and her in-laws to say, you are going to hell because what you're getting as part of your divorce settlement was not part of your nikah. It is not the meher that was, first of
Yeah.
all, the meher is totally stupid what women agree to today, because if they understood how meher is supposed to be determined, it's a totally different story. Anyway, so she was told she's going to go to hell if she takes even a penny more in her divorce settlement. So I said, you know what? On the day of judgment, you put me in front of Allah Ta'ala. I'm telling you, you're not going to go to hell. You take every penny from your settlement. Don't do
Yeah.
this. So there's so
Absolutely,
many
Iram.
things that as women we're like, oh. And
Yeah.
Sitara,
It's
here's
suffocating, isn't
it,
it?
it's
Because the
suffocating.
feeling, emotional, so how do you breathe?
But
How do you
you've got
breathe
to
as a
also,
Muslim woman?
because I'm talking about educated women. So this
Yeah.
woman that I'm talking about is a physician. So she's not an idiot. She's a doctor. So so what happens is, and this is something I want to say, I'll take a couple of minutes and then I'm going to let you talk. When you are talking about, when you start conditioning young children, we're talking about young girls, and they're constantly hearing this message, aurat nakasola kaloti hai, aurat this, aurat that, she needs, grateful women will go to heaven. And who is a grateful woman who is obedient to her husband, and makhawind is majazi khuda. And then you see dramas where it's all about, revolving around the husband. And so I have many students, my I love coaching My ideal clients are young women who have been raised in the West, and they're professional women, but they have such anxiety, Sitara, because they
Mm,
have gone to school here.
they
They've
will.
got degrees. They've got all of that, but their identity, and this is what I want to say, hijab is not a Muslim woman's identity. Their identity, at the core identity level, these women feel unworthy, and
Hmm.
they feel constantly that they have these dreams and ambitions. They want to become leaders in their fields, but they are nothing until they are married. It's like all
Hmm.
their achievements. So one of the things I normally hear is, I was told if I could get good grades, if I could get go to a good college and get a great job, and my brother did all of those. He ticked the boxes. I've also ticked all the boxes, but I'm still not good enough because I'm not
Hmm.
married yet, or my husband is unhappy with me, or I'm divorced. And
Yeah.
there's so much we can unpack here, maybe in a next session. um, so much injustice has been done
Yeah,
to women,
absolutely. And
and
in the
this
name of Islam.
identity of being a good Muslimah, practicing Muslimah. God, that
Yeah.
was infuriating. Thank God I haven't heard it in my life.
No, that's what they say here, practicing Muslima. What I would say to Muslim women, what the obsession with clothing is taking us away from those really high level goals, the high level goals of being a good human being, a compassionate human being, a charitable human being, a financially independent human being who can then do charity with her wages, for example, who can set up institutions. Women who have a great calling, they could become amazing diplomats, they could stop wars. I mean, we're looking at the West centric male leadership model,
Mm-hmm.
right? What's happening across the planet? The planet's burning. There's no leadership. There's a genocide on. There's no leadership. There are wars across the world. There's ethnic cleansing happening. Where is the leadership? There is a nearly interesting point made by a lady, I forget her name. She's really high. She's a really high level official in the United Nations. And she says something. She says, where are all the women from the top diplomatic negotiating tables? Put them there, because what women care about is children not dying,
Yes.
right? So
And
women could be global leaders, women could be politicians, women could be opinion leaders, but our Muslim women are sat there feeling unworthy, thinking a strand of my hair is showing, I'm just going to end up in hell. So what this obsession with clothing does is that it takes us away from the really high level goals in our lives, which we can set. And actually only now the historical conditions have become such that we can access education, we can access jobs. This didn't used to exist before. I mean, Harvard Medical College took its first female medical student in 1945.
wow.
That's only 75 years ago. So
Yeah.
women can now actually access medical education. But when they become doctors, we have these um, awful patriarchal websites like Islam QA. And they will say things like, you cannot practice as a nurse or a doctor because if in your hospital they tell you to wear shirts which have half sleeves and your elbows are showing, that is haram. And you don't want to go to hell, do you? So the same ulama would then say, but men should not send their wives to male doctors.
Mm.
But if a woman wants to become a doctor, then her elbows cannot show. Of course, her elbows will show because for hygiene reasons, you have to scrub your arms when you work
Yeah,
in a
of
hospital.
course. And it's not
So
part of Quora anyway.
it's
So
partly, so this is the issue, is it takes you away from high level goals and it creates certain barriers for you which are insurmountable. So what then happens is that Muslim women who have all of these talents, these capabilities, this emotional maturity are being held back again and again in the name of Islam. And so I'll just coming back to hijab then in relation to that. I think Muslim women themselves are guilty of taking this political agenda forward. Many Muslim women will say, I wear my hijab very proudly, and I don't care if I'm being harassed for it, da 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 da, because my deen demands this from me. And I'm like, does it?
mm,
I don't have a problem with women wearing the hijab. I do object when women say that it's an obligation that God has created on them. I also object to things like the World Hijab Day. What kind of nonsense is that?
mm,
What are we celebrating here? And one of the really cruel things it has done, Iram, is that it has cut off Muslim women from their own culture.
mm-hmm,
Like the beauty of Islam, there's an amazing scholar, Dr. Umar Farooq Abdullah, and he's written this beautiful essay about culture. And
mm,
he says that the reason why Islam lasted so long as a civilization was because it could accommodate cultures. It never uprooted people from their cultural norms and identities. So in China, Islam was Chinese. In Africa, Islam was African. African women still wear these beautiful, bold colors. In Pakistan, in the Punjab, Islam is your kurta shalwar. In Sindh, it's your ajrak. In Indonesia, it's your batik.
Yeah.
That is Islam. But what this kind of Arabization has done is that it's saying to women, you must all wear these long robes and this Arab style scarf on your head. That makes you Muslim. So I would like the audience here to do just a little social science experiment. And after this talk finishes, go on Google and search for images or photographs of Muslim women in Pakistan from the 1970s and 80s.
Mm.
Or open up your family albums and see how your mum and your
Yeah.
aunts are dressed. That was our culture. We have been uprooted from that, and so more and more girls are actually, when you become turn to that austerity, that kind of wearing black, those really depressing colors, that really creative person inside you dies.
Mm-hmm.
So you might have a preference for the color red, but you're going to stop yourself and you're going to force yourself to not wear it. It makes you unhappy internally. So many girls have lost their sense of self and the sense of their cultural identity because they're all wearing this. I mean, it is so sinister now that if you go and look up, if you tell Chat GPT or AI to create an image of a group of Muslim women, that image will have women in an Arab style abaya and a scarf.
Yes.
No
Yes.
longer can you see a Pakistani Muslim woman wearing a beautiful embroidered kurta, or as I said, a Sindhi woman wearing an ajrak.
Mm-hmm.
Why? Because even AI, as it's taking this data in, thinks that a Muslim woman is an Arab woman, is a woman who looks like an
So
Arab.
that's the identity of a Muslim woman.
That is the identity for Muslim women. No, be yourself. Just wear what you're comfortable with. The rules of modesty are simple. Nice,
Yeah, and
dignified
why can't
clothes,
our
loose
conduct
clothes,
be our
cover
identity?
your chest. That's it.
Yeah. And our conduct should be our identity. That's when they
Our
use
conduct.
the comments on my page that the
Yeah.
identity of a Muslim woman is like, no, I will never let my clothes be my identity. I'm sorry. I would rather have you people look at me and, look at my actions. That needs to
Mhm.
be my identity. Another
Absolutely.
thing, I was thinking about another point. There's so much we can unpack on this one subject. Um, yes, and that was by making people conform to a certain way of what I call the taqwa costume. And we see that happening in male men also, the male scholarship, they
Oh,
all
yeah.
seem to belong
Yeah.
to the same country. So it's the taqwa costume. And, Noman Ali Khan, I think, is the one who coined the term because he keeps bringing people's attention to that no, there is no taqwa costume in Islam. So what that does is so first of all, I get so many comments on this that it's been, you know, so a lot of women are going to feel, because as soon as they start turning towards Islam, they really want to learn about Islam. They want to have a connection with Allah Ta'ala. And they're constantly being told the first thing you need to do as a Muslim woman to prove your love for Allah is to cover. So cover, cover, cover. So as a woman, especially Pakistani women, they're going to understand that, first of all, they're really dependent on men, their husbands. They must appear attractive to the husband, otherwise all these other women are potential threats. So now
Mhm.
she's taking herself out of that race by covering, but her husband is now surrounded by, still at work and all those other places where women don't cover. So what happens then, and I've seen this a lot of times, is she's going to secretly start hating all those other women that her potential threats for her, but she now sees herself as less attractive and there's not much she can do about it, so she's just going to hate on all those women. So that creates hatred and
Mhm.
division. And how is that more taqwa? I have never been able to understand that. So, Sitara, what I would
Yeah.
love to do,
But
if I
also self-righteousness. Sorry.
self-righteousness, holier
Sorry.
than thou, which is we are not allowed to
Yeah. And
go
I think that
people.
happens when your piety is externalized. When your piety is externalized, it happens. It happens to male scholars as well, who externalize their piety through their robes and their hats and everything. And the same process happens for women when you externalize. Not all women, but to some women. I can speak for myself that when I was wearing the hijab, I was incredibly judgmental about other women who were not, because I was telling myself, well, if I can put myself through this and this hardship, because you see, it was against my nature. So I had to suppress myself. So if I can do that, if my faith is strong enough for me to do that, why can't that woman? And
Mm.
so you become judgmental. And that also, going back to the point you made, it divides us. So rather than us working collaboratively, we're all sat in our rooms judging each other on our clothes.
Yeah.
Whereas we could actually have higher level shared goals. Let's change the world, I would say. But
I
rather
love
than
it.
changing the world,
To change the
we're
world.
worried we're worried about how we look. So that's kind of there's just one very brief point I want to make, and I think that's something we can build on in a later session. I'm conscious that we've spoken for a period of time, is the Quran's mention of the gaze. Now
Yes.
the gaze is incredibly important, and the Quran mentions it for both men and women. The first thing it does by mentioning the gaze is that it's telling us that both men and women can look at each other in a sexual manner.
Mm.
Both men and women. Women are sexual beings and men are sexual beings. They're both capable of doing that. Therefore, both have been commanded to lower their gaze.
Mm.
The second thing is, if the Quran says that you must lower your gaze, then the hikmah behind it is that the Quran is saying that between your thought and your action, there's a choice.
Yeah. Yeah.
So you look at a person, and after looking at that person, you find them attractive. And then your next thought is to look at them sexually or to imagine something about them. The Quran is saying that is where you stop, which
Mm.
then means that human beings are capable of doing that, right?
Yes, of course.
Okay. But what do our scholars do? Our scholars objectify and dehumanize and demean both men and women. Now, men don't understand this, but in our scholars' conception of hijab, the way it's now told us, men are seen as animals,
Mm. Exactly.
driven by driven by their base instinct. I don't know if anybody's ever seen that photo that was doing the rounds on the internet about 6 or 7 years ago, where there was an unwrapped lollipop and there were flies stuck to it.
Mm.
And there were scholars saying, oh, look at this amazing image. This explains the beauty of the hijab. If a woman is an unwrapped lollipop, of course she's going to attract flies. And I'm sat here thinking, okay, so you're saying that men are flies?
Mm.
That they're disgusting base animals, that they can't control their instincts? Men are lovely, lovely people. And most men around us are very, very decent people. So many men are allies of women fighting oppression,
Mm-hmm.
right? And human beings are not driven by the base instincts because Allah has created us with dignity and He's given us a sense of right and wrong. Now, what our scholars do is when they invoke the doctrine of fitna, a woman is a fitna. She is so tempting that a man can't help himself. Oh my God, he turns into this animal. No, he doesn't. He chooses. He chooses to behave in a certain way. And so this point about the gays, I sometimes think that I could actually write a book about it, but this point about the gays is so powerful because it's reminding us that we have the choice not to leer at people, not to look at them in a perverted way, not to wolf whistle at them, not to catcall them, not to make a point on their appearance. We can choose to look away and control our thought before it becomes sexual. But our scholars don't do that. So what they say to women is, and by the way, they also mess up then the thing the Quran says that every soul shall bear the burden of its own deeds. Now, if
Mm-hmm.
a woman is tempting, she's like a lollipop, then it's now her responsibility to protect the iman of men.
Mm-hmm.
Why? It's the man's job to protect his own iman, right? And he's not a fly, he's a human being, a dignified human being. So when our scholars invoke the doctrine of fitna, the reason why I'm pointing this out is I'm sure there are some men listening to this as well. Please realize that you're being treated as an animal
Mm-hmm.
in this way of thinking, in this doctrine of fitna. You're being treated like an animal and a woman is being treated like an object. She's the
Right.
unwrapped lollipop, you're the fly. This
Mm-hmm.
isn't a great way of looking at human beings. That is not how Allah is looking at us. Allah is saying that you're believers, and because you're believers, you will train your gaze. Now, the other problem with putting the onus on women and telling them to cover up is that in our households now, we have stopped training men. We have stopped training their gaze.
Mm-hmm.
Because what we're telling them is if a woman steps out of the house and she's not covered, she's fair game. You have the right to stare at her because she put herself in front of you,
Mm-hmm.
right? And so the training the gaze, which is a core responsibility of Muslim society, to train the gaze for both men and women, has now been messed up. Women are being told to cover up, and men are being told, well, you can stare at her because she's not covered up. And
Mm-hmm.
so the onus is now then shifted on the woman to protect a man's iman, and a man's reduced to an animal. and he's told not to train his gaze. Whereas when I was growing up, we were told in our house, my brother was told, do not look at women in a bad way. There's somebody's daughter, there's somebody's wife, there's somebody's sister. Do not ever leer at women. I will not tolerate it if I ever hear that you've said a bad word to another woman. We were training our boys' gazes. I have done that with my sons to
And
train the gaze,
yeah,
right?
there's
So we're
something.
not doing that anymore for men.
Yeah, and there's something to be said when it's not just training the gazes, when you start doing that at a young age with
Mm.
boys, there's, your brain is still developing. It is teaching you discipline, it is teaching you respect for another human being, it is teaching you respect for women. So when you don't train the men, you actually are training them to be animals. And that's
Yes.
what we see in Pakistan, because
Yeah.
no woman is safe from a lot of these men in Pakistan, whether
No,
you're even wearing a burqa.
no,
You're
you're not. And even online, Iram, the amount of abuse we get online.
not.
I'll
Yeah.
give you an example. The other day, my son was looking quite outraged on the dining table. And he said to me, he said there was this video on Twitter of this young lady. She was 17 or 18, very young lass, wore a hijab, by the way. And she had raised 20,000 pounds or something for Palestine. So
Wow.
she's been doing this fundraising. She's raised huge amounts of money and she wants to raise more money. So she was doing this video. She's wearing a hijab. And he said that every comment under her video was saying, you're wearing a hijab, but I can still see a bit of your neck.
Mm.
So what my son was saying to me, my twins are 21 now, mashallah, they're sensible. He said, Mom, why is it that Muslim men talk like molesters?
Yeah.
Why is this man, he's right, why is this man sitting here not seeing the young girl for the charity that she's done and the hard work, but his entire focus is on this inch of skin showing under her scarf? Why are our men now looking at women as if they're potentially just going to attack them? So, the disservice that our scholars have done for Muslim society is they have taken the onus away from men and women to train the gaze, especially men, and women have been held responsible for it. So that's why we can, talk about hijab for another 4 hours because the implications of it for society, for women, for us, for our sense of community are huge, and they're not understood. And I think it's doing huge amounts of damage to Muslim relationships, and it's causing huge amounts of antagonism, and Muslim women feel under siege all the time. They're not able to breathe. The number of young women that I talk to and they say, oh, please, can you tell me what are the rules that I need to follow? I'm like, all the rules are for women. Just be, just know that all of the rules are for women.
Yeah.
So it is a complex issue, but I think we need to keep
We will
sharing
have,
what it
we
is
will
in the
continue to
Quran,
have these talks. I think
inshallah.
for a lot of women, even today, even I know I saw a lot of comments saying, oh my God, this was eye-opening. It's still going to take a few listens. You need to listen to this talk again and again. It took us a while too. The conditioning is not that easy to overcome. It's going to take you a while where you're going to take one step forward and you're going to say, I have some breathing room. Oh my God, I can't believe I have these rights. And then you're going to
Mhm,
be scared and you're going to say, surely I don't have more rights than this. And then
mhm,
you're going to take a few more steps forward and you're going to say, oh my God, I can breathe some more. I can't believe I have the. And one day you're going to realize and say, oh my God, I am free. I am
yeah.
actually free. And Allah made me free. And I have pretty much all the same rights. And we'll get into that in, like I said, some other talk, that we are equal. Number one, please understand that Allah created us equal. There is no hierarchy that is gender based.
Mm.
However, based on your roles, you will have different rights and responsibilities. That's a whole different topic. It does not have to do with gender. It's just like if you're a mother, your responsibility is going to be different versus if you're a single woman. It's just,
Yeah.
so it's not gender based. So we'll talk about
Mhm.
that later. Um, I wanna ask you one question that I do want to address, because this is the second time I've seen it. The right of divorce. If you can quickly say something about that, I know we're out of time. Why is it that a man is able to divorce a woman or verbally and stuff, and a woman is not?
Mm. This is very complicated, so I think I'm going to choose not to answer.
Then
But
we'll do
what
it
I
next time.
we do that separate. But what I will say is that, in my view, and this is where the law needs reform, if going into a marriage requires a formal documented process where rights and responsibilities are addressed, then I think going out of marriage should be the same.
I
In
agree.
other words, verbal divorce should be absolutely banned. It should be made illegal.
I agree.
Divorce should always be in writing, and it must always be done through an arbitration process. I'm just going to say that and park it there. And then,
That's
inshallah,
good.
at a
That's
future
fine. Yeah.
conversation,
And
we
I
can.
would just want to add a couple of things to that. That remember what we said earlier in the conversation, that you have to remember the times during which Quran was revealed and paper was, not available. It wasn't invented. And reading and writing were things that very few people did. So you've got to keep all of that in mind. And now it's very, very simple. Everybody does it. And also remember that certain things were given as suggestions to people, and then we were supposed to build on them as
Mhm,
societies, as civilizations got modernized. And then another thing I always say is that please do your own research.
mhm,
Please do not, this is advice from me as an older sister to other women, that always be, when you're listening to different scholars, especially, even female scholars, a lot of them, what they do is they free thinkers, like what, Sitara is an independent researcher. She doesn't belong to this school or this sect. A lot of what the female scholars do is they regurgitate whatever they've been hearing from other male scholars, which are still part of the patriarchal hijacking. So be very careful about that. Look, there are other independent researchers as well, like Sitara. There are other independent, they're free thinkers. For example, Ramdi Saab, even, although he also has a certain school of thought, but still, and he's been ostracized for his free thinking. So do your own research. Remember this. This is a great time where we're going to be learning, inshallah, uh, how to how we will see this reform that's happening in Islam. And the final note that I would like to say, whenever you hear this is one of the favorite things that scholars like to say, is pe ijma hai, ummat ka ijma hai ummat hai. First of all, how did that ijma take place? And then please keep in mind, I said this to a scholar's face last time and he went red. He was not happy to hear it. I said, how can you say ijma ummat when 50% of ummat is women? Where was the female representation in your scholarship? If you didn't have women in that group or whatever, how can it be ijma ummat? So no, I'm
no,
sorry.
it's not.
I told
Yeah.
him I reject your ruling. He was not happy about it. So
Yeah, but that's I'm glad you mentioned ijma. We can talk about it, but just to say that ijma is the word used to silence a conversation. It has that word has a political role to play, which is silencing. There is no ijma on anything in Islam, and inshallah we can talk about that. I want to just, if it's okay, Iram, just ask the audience here to. Um, I'm going to use a metaphor. I'm going to use a metaphor to try to imagine this. It's taken me a long time as well to understand this. You can think of the Quran as a very finely calibrated watch. It's like a Swiss Rolex of the highest quality. Let's put it that way. Um, the book has no contradiction in it. It is the only book in the world which has no contradiction in it because the author is Allah. Now, as a finely calibrated watch, if you imagine that if a second's hand or a minute's hand or the hour's hand goes out of sync, the watch can't tell time,
mhm.
right? It kind of breaks, the whole thing breaks. The beauty of the Quran is that the moment you try to put an unjust ruling into it, or you mess about with one verse, the rest of it stops making sense.
Wow. Wow.
So think of it like that it's a beautifully, perfectly calibrated mechanism.
Mm.
It will displace things. I'll give you an example. If the Quran says that marriage, and it defines marriage as a relationship where there is affection, muadda, compassion, rahma, and shura, consultation.
Mm.
Then, if you start to put wife beating into the Quran,
It will.
those other verses go out of sync.
Yes.
Okay. Now, that intuitive sense of the Quran is really important. Our relationship with the Quran, it will make sense and it will come together nicely. It will be like a watch that works perfectly, it will be calibrated. If you mess around with the seconds hand or the minutes hand, it will just go into this chaos. And remember, it can't. because it's a book without contradiction. So the Quran cannot contradict itself by, on one hand, giving dignity to human beings, and on the other hand, saying you can hit your wife. So it's about what assumptions we make when we approach the Quran, and that affects how we understand the Quran. So I'm just going to leave it at that thought.
I think it was so beautiful. And that if you are finding contradiction, then the contradiction is in your thinking or your understanding,
And
not
we
in your
need to reconcile it. Yeah.
Quran. Exactly. That's what I used to do too. Like Allah cannot be, there cannot be contradiction in
Mhm.
even what Quran says and the seerah of the Prophet Sallallahu Alaihi Wasallam.
Mhm.
This was so beautiful, Sitara. I can't tell you how honored I am. I am so grateful to you for being so open and bold and truthful and being yourself. And, it has been just an honor. So thank you so much. I want to thank it's like I have seen some pretty steady numbers. This was a 2 hour long
I
conversation.
know it's been a
It
long conversation.
dropped. It
Yeah.
hasn't dropped. It's actually grown. So please, here's what I request you guys. This is an effort I'm making, Sitara is making. This is the part we're doing. Now you have to do your part. Share this message with as many people as you can. Go and join Sitara's channel, which is on YouTube under her name, Sitara Akram. Watch the videos she has already made, and we're going to request her to make more videos. And one of the things I'm thinking about doing is maybe to collaborate with Sitara and convince her to do some classes for us, for Quran classes, so we could understand some of these things in longer sessions and can ask questions and interact in the class. So if you like that idea, send it to me in the comments. And if there are enough yeses, then we will try to convince Sitara to do this for us, because she already teaches and
Somehow find time.
yeah, somehow find the time. But you're already a professor, so this won't be something new for you.
Not quite yet, not quite yet, Iram. But inshallah, I hope Allah gives lots of barakah to what you said just now. But
Inshallah.
that's the dream, that inshallah in a few years' time that I apply for a professorship.
Inshallah. Inshallah.
Inshallah.
Thank you so much, my
Thank
dear.
you so much, Iram, and
Take
thank you
care.
for your time and the generosity as well of all of our listeners who've just been so engaged. So I do want to thank them for persevering over this long session. Thank you very much.
Thank
Assalamu
you very much. Allah Hafiz to all.
alaikum.